I'm Mike Watson. I'm 76 years old. This morning, I sat at my kitchen table here in Bayside, Fort Wayne, and I wrote a check to the funeral home, the final payment. For most people, I imagine that's a grim task. For me, it made me smile. You see, that money was gone once before. I spent it, every last dollar of it. I took the $8,500 I'd meticulously saved for my own funeral, and I blew it on a last-minute trip to Italy with my wife, Cheryl. I regret it, and I don't regret it at all. Let me tell you what happened. It started on a gray Tuesday last April. A retired journalist's habits die hard. I was in my home office doing my annual ritual, updating files, checking the will, making sure everything was in order. I'm an organized guy, always have been. I opened the fireproof lockbox. There it all was. The deed, the passports, the important papers. And right on top, a plain white envelope. It was thick, heavy. I'd written final expenses on it in my own handwriting. $8,500 in cash. My offering for a tidy, planned exit. Holding that envelope, I felt settled. I felt responsible, like I'd done my duty. Later that same afternoon, I found Cheryl on the back porch. She was on her laptop. She didn't hear me come out. She was scrolling through a friend's photos from Tuscany. She didn't say a word. No sigh of, "I wish we could go." She just went very still. I watched her trace the outline of a vineyard on the screen with her finger. The light from the screen lit her face, and in her eyes I saw a quiet, distant longing. It was a look I hadn't seen in a long, long time. Watching her, a memory surfaced. It was 1982. We were at Tony's Pizzeria, celebrating my first real journalism job. We were poor, but we were happy. We'd splurged on a bottle of cheap Chianti. I held her hand across that red checkered tablecloth. I made a promise. "One day, Cheryl," I said, "we'll drink this stuff where it's made. We'll see those hills." Life happened. Wonderful, full life. 5 kids, 4 grandkids, a career, a home. That one day kept getting pushed to the horizon. It was always a tomorrow thing. Back on the porch, looking at my wife of 52 years, that envelope in my lockbox didn't feel like planning anymore. It felt like surrender, like I was planning for the end and giving up on the middle. For 3 days, I wrestled with it. Then, on Friday morning, I did it. My hand was shaking. I called our travel agent, Linda. I gave her my credit card number for a deposit. I took every single dollar from that final expenses envelope. I drove to the bank. I deposited it back into our checking account. It felt like I was embezzling from my own estate, like I was robbing the future Mike Watson to pay for the present one. I booked 2 tickets to Rome for the following month, but I couldn't tell Cheryl yet. I was too ashamed. And I was scared. First, I had to tell the person who represented everything I was seemingly betraying. My oldest son, David. I took David fishing on the Maumee. It's our spot for tough talks. I told him about the trip. I asked for his help looking after the house while we were gone. Then I took a breath and came clean about the money. He stopped mid-cast. He just stopped. "Dad, that's irresponsible," he said, his voice low and careful. "What if something happens over there?" The disappointment in his tone. It was the same tone I'd used on him when he was 16 and crashed the family station wagon. The roles were completely reversed. I was the kid now. His words sat with me. They became this anchor of guilt I dragged behind me, even as Cheryl and I packed our bags and got on that plane to Rome. We landed in Rome, and for the first 2 days, I was a ghost in my own vacation. David's words echoed in every ancient street. Irresponsible. I'd see an old couple moving slow and think, what if one of us falls? I'd look at a price on a menu and convert it to dollars, thinking of that envelope. Cheryl was wide-eyed, taking everything in, but I could tell she was puzzled by me. I was there, but I wasn't present. I was still back in Fort Wayne, defending my decision to a jury in my head. I waited until our 3rd day in Venice. I thought the beauty might soften the blow. We were on a vaporetto at sunset, the Grand Canal all molten gold, the palazzos looking like pink and orange cakes. Cheryl was leaning against the railing, the breeze in her hair. She looked so peaceful. I knew I had to tell her. I couldn't carry the secret anymore. It was poisoning the trip. I moved closer, put my arm around her. "Cheryl," I said, my voice almost lost in the engine noise and the water. "This trip, it's a surprise, but it's more than that." I took a breath. I used the funeral money, the whole thing. That's how we're here. She didn't pull away. She didn't say anything. She just kept looking at the water, at the passing buildings. Then she squeezed my hand where it rested on her shoulder. She leaned her head against mine. She didn't speak for a long time. When she finally did, her voice was quiet. "Oh, Mike." That was all. No anger, no joy. Just a quiet, bewildered acceptance. It wasn't the absolution I was hoping for, but it wasn't a rejection either. It was just a fact. We floated on in silence, and the guilt stayed, a cold stone in my gut. But then something started to shift. We took the train to Florence. We walked through the Uffizi, and Cheryl stopped in front of Botticelli's Primavera. She didn't just glance and move on. She stood there for 20 minutes. She started talking about the symbolism, the flowers, the way the figures moved. She'd read a book about it years ago. Her voice had a fervor I hadn't heard in years. It was the voice of the young woman who'd studied art history before life got practical. I just stood beside her and listened. I watched the light in her eyes, not the painting. In a rental car, we drove into the Tuscan hills. We got lost on purpose, down narrow roads lined with cypress trees. We stopped the car, got out, and just stood there. She closed her eyes and breathed in deep. "Smell that, Mike?" she said. "Cypress and earth and sun." It smells like sun. She opened her eyes and grinned at me. It was a pure, unguarded grin. We weren't talking about cholesterol medications or which grandkid at a soccer tournament. We were talking about the color of the clay in the fields, the shape of the clouds over the hill towns, the way the olive oil tasted different, greener, right here. The light in her eyes became my new compass. It started to drown out David's voice. But the final reckoning happened in Positano, on the Amalfi Coast. We'd found a tiny trattoria perched on the side of the cliff, with a little terrace overlooking the sea. It was so blue it didn't look real. We were eating spaghetti alla vongole, the best we'd ever had. Cheryl had a glass of local white wine. She was glowing. The sun, the salt air, the food, it had all come together. She looked younger. She looked alive. I looked at her and the guilt came rushing back, but this time mixed with a fierce, protective love. I had to know. I set my fork down. Cheryl, I said, about the money, I need to know. Do you think I was selfish? Do you think I was wrong? She put her fork down too. She reached across the little table, past the bread basket and the wine bottle, and took both my hands in hers. Her hands were warm. She looked right at me. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a second my heart sank. But then she laughed, a bright, clear, wonderful sound that carried over the terrace. Mike Watson, she said, her voice thick but smiling. You old fool. This is the most romantic, irresponsible, wonderful thing you've ever done. She squeezed my hands. All those years, you were the provider, the planner. You made sure everyone was taken care of, and I love you for it. But this? She looked out at the sea, then back at me, her eyes shining. This was you taking care of us, of a promise we made over cheap wine at Tony's. This was you saying our story isn't over yet. She wiped a tear away, still laughing. So no, you weren't selfish. You were finally a little bit crazy. And I love you for that, too. In that moment, sitting there with the Mediterranean spread out below us, and my wife's hands in mine, the last knot of guilt came undone. It just dissolved. It floated away on that sea breeze. I felt the weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even known I was carrying for 52 years. We finished our lunch and we talked about nothing and everything. We were lighter. The money was spent, gone, but we were richer. The rest of the trip was pure gift. We came home to Bayside suntanned and tired in the best way, our phones full of photos. But coming home meant facing the practical consequences I'd postponed. There was no envelope in the lockbox anymore, just an empty space. That empty space in the lockbox stared back at me for a week. I'd open it to get a passport for one of the grandkids, and there it was, that void where certainty used to be. David came over to help me set up a new printer, and I could feel him watching me, waiting for me to say something about the plan. I didn't. I just couldn't. The peace from Positano felt fragile here, under the gray Fort Wayne sky, surrounded by the familiar weight of my desk, my files, my responsibilities. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. They always seem to. About a month after we got back. David and his wife Sarah were over for dinner. Cheryl was showing them our photos on the big screen TV. There was one of us in that trattoria in Positano, both of us laughing, squinting in the sun, a half-empty wine glass between us. Cheryl looked so happy. Sarah said, "You two look like you're on your honeymoon." And David, he just nodded slowly and said, "Yeah, you do." After dinner, Cheryl and Sarah went out to the porch. David stayed at the table with me, finishing his coffee. We sat in silence for a minute. Then he put his mug down. "Dad," he said, "we need to talk about the funeral thing." My stomach tightened. "I know," I said. "I'm working on a new plan." "That's not what I mean," he said. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he got from me. "Look, when you told me on the river, I was scared for you, for Mom. I thought you were being impulsive, reckless. I thought you'd stop thinking about us, about what we'd have to deal with if something went wrong." I started to speak, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish. Seeing Mom tonight, seeing those pictures. I talked to her last week. She told me about the promise, the one at Tony's." He looked down at his hands. "I realized something. I've been treating you like you're already gone." That hit me like a physical thing. I just stared at him. "You had this money set aside," he continued, his voice quiet. "This envelope. And in my head, that envelope was mine. It was my responsibility to come, my checklist item. When you spent it, it felt like you'd taken something that belonged to my future, not yours." He looked up and his eyes were wet. "I'm sorry, Dad. I made you feel like a burden you needed to prepay. That was wrong." I couldn't speak. All the guilt, all the tension I'd been carrying since that fishing trip, it just melted. It was replaced by this aching, overwhelming love for my son. This practical, responsible man I'd raised, who was now sitting here, gutting himself to apologize for being too much like me. "David," I finally managed, my voice rough, "you weren't wrong to be worried. It was irresponsible. By the book. I broke the plan." "But maybe the plan was broken," he said. He almost smiled. "You provided for us our whole lives, Dad. College, weddings, down payments. You were the rock. And I think I just expected you to keep providing, right to the very end, so we wouldn't have to lift a finger, so we wouldn't have to feel any discomfort. That's not fair. That's not love. That's convenience." He reached across the table and put his hand over mine. His hand is bigger than mine now. "You provided Mom with a memory she'll carry forever. You provided me with a lesson I didn't know I needed. That's a different kind of provision." I cried then. I'm not ashamed to say it. I sat at my own kitchen table and cried in front of my son. Not from sadness, But from this sheer staggering relief, the last wall came down. The judge in my head finally left the bench. We talked for an hour after that. We made a new plan, right there on a napkin. A modest, sensible plan. No envelope of cash. A small life insurance policy that would cover the basics without a fancy show. He insisted on helping with the premiums. "Let me provide a little," he said. When Cheryl and Sarah came back in, their faces fell when they saw my red eyes. But David just stood up, hugged his mom, and said, "We're all good." And we were. The next morning I called the funeral home. I'd been avoiding it. I met with a nice young man named Ben. I told him I needed to start over, from scratch, simpler. He didn't bat an eye. He just opened a new folder. We picked a simple casket, a basic service at our church. No limousine procession, just the family, some hymns, and a few stories. He tallied it up. It came to a fraction of what had been in that envelope. Writing that check this morning was the final step. It wasn't a burden, it was just a task. And as I sealed the envelope, I didn't think about caskets or flowers. I thought about Cheryl's face on that terrace, laughing through her tears. I thought about David's hand on mine at the kitchen table. I thought about the photo of us in Positano. That's when I knew, really knew. I'd spent my whole life believing my value was in being the reliable one, the planner, the provider who left no loose ends. But that trip and the chaos it caused taught me something else. The most important thing you can leave isn't a settled account. It's a settled heart. It's the knowledge in your wife's eyes that you kept the wildest promise. It's the respect in your son's voice when he realizes you're still a man, not just a patriarch. The money in that envelope was for an ending. But the truth is, we'd already paid for the best parts of our ending every single day of our marriage, in kindness, in patience, in showing up. The funeral is just a day, a logistical day. Italy was 2 weeks of living, and the memory of it, that's forever. That's the real inheritance. That's the real inheritance. And here's what I understand now, sitting here at 76, with a check written and the trip a beautiful memory. I was saving for an event, a single day of logistics, flowers, and a suit I wouldn't even feel. I was providing for my kids' convenience, for a smooth, tidy transition where they wouldn't have to think too hard or feel too much practical discomfort. And there's a duty in that, I won't deny it. But Italy, that was 2 weeks of life. That was providing for my wife's soul, and in doing so, for my own. I was the organized provider, the journalist with all the facts filed, for 76 years. For those 2 weeks, I chose to be the present husband, and that presence created something more valuable than any prepaid plan, a living, breathing story we all now share. I was wrong about what responsibility meant at this stage. I thought it was about tying up every loose end so no one was inconvenienced. But David helped me see that sometimes The most responsible thing you can do is trust the people you raised. Trust them to be capable, to handle things, to be okay with a little mess. My obsession with the envelope was, in a way, a lack of faith. It was me saying, I don't trust you to manage this without a detailed map and a stack of cash. Letting go of that, spending that money, forced a different kind of conversation. It forced us to talk as adults, as a family, not just as a patriarch and his heirs. And what grew from that was stronger than any prearranged funeral package. So here's my direct advice for anyone sitting on a similar envelope, literal or figurative, labeled for the end. Look at that money hard. Stare it down. Is there a sliver of it, even a small one, that could pay for a beginning instead? A real, breathing, laughing beginning, right now. Maybe it's not Italy. Maybe it's a weekend at a quiet lake, renting the same cabin you did on your honeymoon. Maybe it's front row tickets to a symphony, holding hands in the dark as the music swells. Maybe it's a ridiculously fancy dinner where you talk about dreams you've deferred, not doctor's appointments or utility bills. You identify that thing, that spark you see growing dim in your partner's eyes, or even in your own. And you pay for that. Let your kids figure out the rest. They're smarter, more resilient, and more loving than you give them credit for. You taught them. Trust the work you did. The story you give them of their parents choosing joy, choosing each other, choosing life, even when the calendar is full of years. That story will be worth more than a perfectly balanced ledger. It will teach them how to live, not just how to manage an ending. I still have regrets. Of course I do. I regret the weeks of secret guilt I carried. I regret the disappointment I caused David before he understood. I regret not doing it 10 years sooner. But that last regret is the most important one because it tells me the truth. The time is always now. You still have time. Maybe not for a transatlantic flight, but for something. For a drive to the next town over for a pie contest. For a photography class you take together, even if your hands shake a little. For a morning of yoga in the park, just the two of you, breathing in the air that's still yours to breathe. You have this day. Pay for this. This channel, from what I understand, is full of stories like mine. People who've lived a long time and learned a few things the hard way. So maybe you don't have to. If this story of a stubborn old journalist from Fort Wayne and his trip to Italy meant something to you, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe and turn on those notifications. There are more voices here, more wisdom gathered from all these years of getting it wrong, and sometimes, eventually, getting it right. And leave me a comment down below. Tell me, what's your Italy? What's the thing you've been putting off? The promise you made that's gathering dust? Or, if you've already taken the leap, tell me about it. I'd love to hear your story. If this resonated, if it made you think of someone, hit that like button. And please share it. Share it with your brother who's all about the spreadsheets, with your mom who's always putting herself last, with your friend who talks about someday, but whose eyes have gotten a little quiet. Maybe you've got a story of your own, a lesson learned at 60 or 70 or 80. Something about love or family or forgiveness, or just about living while you're still here to do it. There's a form in the description where you can submit it. Maybe next time we'll be sharing your words. Your wisdom is needed too. A book that found me after I got back that helped me frame all this is called The Gift of Years by Joan Chittister. It's not about travel or funerals. It's about this stage of life, about letting go and embracing what's left. I've left a link in the description if you're curious. Don't be like the old me. Don't confuse provision with presence. Don't save so diligently for an ending that you forget to fund the living you have left. Look at your person. Listen to the quiet between their words. And then be a little irresponsible in the very best way. Be a romantic fool. The story you create will be the best thing you ever leave them. Thanks for listening. This is Mike Watson, signing off from Bayside, Fort Wayne, with a lighter heart, a well-traveled soul, and an empty envelope I don't miss one bit.